At the beginning of my senior year here at BYU, I began worrying whether I was making the right decision about my future. One day in the fall, Lisa asked me if there was anyone who could possibly help me that I hadn't already talked with. Without a moment's hesitation, I said yes. If I could only talk to the president of BYU, who was then Jeffrey R. Holland, that would clear everything up. Several weeks prior to my graduation, I attended my senior capstone class. As I prepared to leave the building after class, I noticed there was a crowd that was gathering at the west doors. So I worked my way to the front of the doors and discovered the reason no one was leaving was because it was a complete downpour. I put a daily universe over my head and I started running through the parking lot. The newspaper turned to a pulpy mush and I was soaked almost immediately. I was truly in a blue mood and felt very down. So I walked very slowly. As I walked past the Brim Hall building, I heard someone yell out, "You need this more than I do." And I looked across the street and there was President Holland holding up an umbrella. And he responded by opening the rear passenger door of his car and offering me a ride home. Sister Holland, who was already in the car, greeted me as President Holland got into the driver's seat. "Where can I take you?" President Holland asked as he looked at me through the rear view mirror. My wife and I were managing apartments south of campus at the time, and I kind of hesitated in telling him where I lived because I didn't think he would be very impressed. But with the president of the university looking at me in the eye, I confessed the name of the complex. And President and Sister Holland chuckled and said, "Pat and I managed those apartments when we were undergraduates at BYU." I was stunned. My tiny brain couldn't comprehend that President Jeffrey R. Holland actually lived in the same apartment that I was living in. Impossible. We started driving south on Campus Drive past the Mazer building. As I sat in this car, I suddenly realized that 7 months previous, I told my wife that if I could only talk to President Holland, then I was confident I could receive helpful direction. And here I was sitting in a car with him. I mustered my courage and I asked, "President Holland, have you ever been so discouraged that you didn't know if things would ever work out? Did you ever worry that you might not make it after all?" He looked at me through the rearview mirror and answered again, to my surprise, "Yes, I did." We drove to my complex and I moved toward the car door to get out. But President Holland put the car in park and he and Sister Holland turned in their seats to face me. And we talked. At one point in our conversation, he said, "Matt, part of your problem is that you don't believe." I admit I felt a little badly, as if my testimony was considered to be subpar. "Oh," he said, "I'm not talking about your testimony. You just believe that God will work his mighty miracles for everyone but you." And his assessment was actually right. And then he said, with his typical fervor, "You gotta believe, Matt. You gotta believe." He then offered some more sound counsel, heaps of encouragement, and I got out of the car. I stood and waved until they were out of sight. Upon entering our apartment, I shared this experience with my wife, and we wept together. And we wrote the experience down so we would always remember.